In this conclusion of my 3-part analysis on Starfleet tactics, I wanted to dedicate a video to the Dominion War and beyond specifically. The Dominion conflict was a flashpoint for Starfleet. It would irrevocably change the officers and organization itself. Arguably, it set the Federation on a path for the dystopia that would be seen in the future. But at a minimum, at least the surviving admirals would be good at Raid Shadow Legends. So look, I'm going to level with you guys. This absolutely is a paid sponsorship, but I honestly enjoy Raid Shadow Legends, and I've enjoyed it for a while. The game is a lot of fun with great graphics and epic scenarios. It's really well developed, and take my advice that I'm always giving you. Don't take my word for it. Use my QR code or links below to download Raid for yourself, either on your mobile phone or PC. Looking at Raid specifically, I did talk about it in the last game, but one of my favorite parts is putting together your team and seeing how they fare in battle. The more I play, the more I find new characters that I absolutely love. At this time, the two I would suggest for you guys are Valerie and the Arbiter. Not only are these two great characters, and we'll talk about that in a minute, they are also pretty easily obtainable so that you can get into the fight fast. Valerie is one of the early game support champions and really helps you out. You are likely to get her in the first campaign stage, so it's almost guaranteed you'll be playing with her. She shields your team so they can take more damage and even heals when the need arises. While keeping your people protected, she'll also buff them so they can hit for maximum damage. I wouldn't just stop with her though. The Arbiter is a legendary character that you can get by completing missions. She's probably the best character that resurrects teammates that I've found so far. On top of that, she buffs her team's attack and even heals. Luckily, her abilities allow you to lower the buffs of the enemy so that she takes care of those pesky ne'er-do-wells. I've stated it before, but for me personally, I really enjoy the campaign. Raid does have a lot of great options when it comes to PvP, from clans to fighting in the arena, but I think the story is where it's at. It's in depth, they put thought into the writing, and the voice acting is pretty top notch. You can watch your characters progress, and when things get hard, you go back and work on the armor and weapons. As you fight, you'll be joined by new allies that you can switch out. You watch your team work together to defeat the bad guys and win the day. How much more fun can that be? Raid just hit their 2-year anniversary with a load of events and tournaments going on right now. If you move quickly, you might still be able to catch some of these special events and get your hands on some free gifts and rewards. The schedule is absolutely jam-packed until the middle of April, with insane anniversary events and tournaments that have anniversary-sized prizes to win. You might also be able to get involved in the very first clan versus clan tournament with chances of going up against another clan itself. Raid also released a new Shadowkin faction. It's inspired by traditional Asian folklore with characters that look amazing. On top of that, they have 2 new updates, which includes a new Doom Tower rotation with 2 tough new bosses. So, honestly guys, what do you have to lose? If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description or scan the QR code. If you're a new player, you'll get your free epic champion, Jotan, who is awesome at the Doom Tower by the by, 100,000 silver, thousands people of silver, 50 gems, and 3 ancient shards so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in the game. I mean, look at this sexy beast you'll get for free. I mean, just look at him. Remember, you'll find your extra rewards here in your inbox for the next 30 days only. Leveling with you guys, they decided to help out a single dad. Least you can do is download and check them out. Definitely let me know what you think about it, and maybe we'll see each other as we become legends. Before we completely break down the tactics scene in the Dominion War, let's rewind and consider the Borg Collective for a moment.
Again, Mr. Wolf.
As I've stated in previous videos, ship-to-ship combat for the most part appeared to be relatively small scale, whether it was the Klingons versus V'ger, the Enterprise C versus Romulans, or the Enterprise D versus almost anyone. The vessels that fight in a single battle were just a handful. In retrospect, this does make some tactical sense. Space is vast, so committing larger fleets into a single battle does leave large gaps in your defense network. Additionally, while there are vessels around to assist, getting a larger fleet might take time. Indeed, the really only large battles include that of the Binary Stars, with roughly 12 Starfleet ships against over 20 Klingon vessels, and a few brush fires during the 23rd century that fielded possibly a dozen vessels or less, all combined. But again, even during the Klingon War of the early 23rd century, or the brush fires of the mid to late 23rd century, these were the exception and not the rule. It seemed unreasonable for large-scale battles like these to be the norm. However, the Battle of Wolf 359 effectively changed this mentality. 40 Starfleet ships were brought together in a slipshod manner in an attempt to defeat one Borg cube. They ultimately would fail and leave Sector 001 open for assimilation. After the cube was defeated and the end of the Borg War, Starfleet strategists and designers now had to conceive of battles and wars that would be fought at a larger scale. Dozens upon dozens of vessels that fought a singular enemy strong enough to destroy them all, or possibly battles that would have tens, if not hundreds of ships, was now a possibility. As stated before, this created the need for the Intrepid class, the Sovereign, the Akira, the Defiant, and others. Weapon systems would be upgraded, tactics improved upon, and entire stations redesigned in order to fight squadrons upon squadrons of vessels. On that note, there would be revitalization and use of starfighters, tactics being crafted to utilize them as support ships and distractions. These tactics and upgrades would become useful when the Klingon Empire pulled out of the Khitomer Accords and ultimately invaded the Federation. Klingon forces would invade the Arcanus sector, retaking it after a brief battle. Starfleet, knowing that the Dominion was the real threat, didn't fully commit to the war with the Klingons. This resulted in the slow push of the Klingon Empire into Federation territory. The war would end when the changeling Martok was exposed and the Khitomer Accords reinstated. Unfortunately, the losses in this war would be felt in the Dominion conflict. Speaking of said Dominion War, Starfleet found itself initially in a Cold War with losses being relatively one-sided, as the Dominion would be able to destroy Starfleet ships with little to no consequence. An alliance with Cardassia and troop buildup forced Starfleet's hand, and mining of the wormhole would result in the Dominion War. The strategies used here would largely be radically different from previous conflicts. Large-scale combat between the Starfleet Alliance and the Dominion War occurred frequently. These battles revolved around holding strategic targets like that of the Bajoran wormhole, the Vulcan border, and Chintaka, with most of space just being left open. This doesn't mean that there weren't small ship-to-ship engagements, that they didn't occur. Again, space is vast. The need for smaller, agile vessels would be absolutely necessary. This would result in ships like the Intrepid, Akira, and Kitbashed vessels taking up the line. They'd be able to identify oncoming fleets and hopefully return in time, if not just engage one-on-one. Additionally, smaller squadrons of vessels would also travel together in order to overtake single scout ships they came upon. The outcomes of these fights would be based on the strategies of the individual vessels, the element of surprise, and ability to flee. Larger combat roles for the vessels at this time can be somewhat hard to parse out. However, based on battles like that at the Sacrifice of Angels and others, there are some inferences we can make. First, various fleets would mainly be utilized for defense or large-scale engagement, with smaller vessels being dispatched on individual missions. So let's take a look at what most likely the layout for a fleet was. The inner circle for any Starfleet would have one or several command and control vessels. This includes Galaxy-class starships, Sovereigns, and possibly even Excelsiors. The secondary defense screens would include ships such as the Akira, Intrepid, and Steamrunner vessels, those that were hardier and able to defend the command and control vessels better. The outer line would include Defiance, Miranda-class vessels, possibly Intrepids as well. There would also be starfighters and more. These defenses would allow the command and control vessels to hopefully better command their units to win battles. Unfortunately, we don't see that happening. Even at the Sacrifice of Angels, or both battles of Chintaka, the tactics of Starfleet seem lackluster. When Starfleet would engage an enemy fleet, the lines almost instantly crumbled, enemy vessels able to instantly push past the lines and get to the command and control vessels. Like we see in the Sacrifice of Angels, this would end with smaller skirmishes happening within the larger battle. Starfleet vessels would be fighting 2-on-1, 3-on-2, or 3-to-1. These tactics would persevere until arguably the last battle where, thanks to the Breen superweapon and Jem'Hadar's suicide tactics, the Starfleet Alliance had finally learned to keep their ranks tight. The Dominion War also ultimately weeded out captains and personnel that had more of an affinity for science and exploration, versus that of being warriors or tacticians. With Starfleet's ranks dwindling, a mad dash to promote and train people swept across the institution. Those who were good at battle and good at being able to think on their feet would be promoted over those who knew how to analyze different flowers or wanted to explore space. While the tactics that came from the Dominion War stuck with the Federation, there would be one exception to the previously mentioned layering strategy. When fighting an enemy where a focus is required to take on a singular, more viable threat, the vessels generally would swarm, causing damage across the entirety of the vessel. Though again, this would not be as prevalent given that most enemies didn't have such a massive advantage. The Starfleet that came out of the Dominion War would be irrevocably changed. Vessels would be designed for science and combat. This would continue until Starfleet would effectively have ships that were combat-oriented. These vessels would daylight as science vessels. Past this point, it can be somewhat difficult to break down Starfleet tactics or what occurred. We do know that Starfleet became a temporal power and would begin fighting a temporal war. Most of Starfleet would be destroyed due to the burn and their numbers reduced to arguably just a handful of ships. The vessels would be so weak that they would have to contend with cartels and local militias. Starfleet would have to rely on small numbers and keeping their location secret just to survive. Abandoned by most member worlds, including Vulcan, Earth, and likely Andor, they would constantly be fighting on the defensive. Though the crumbling of the Emerald Chain likely meant that slowly they would begin exploring again and building their ranks. However, it's unknown if they would ever be able to garner their former strength. We're just going to have to stay tuned. At the end of the day, this is my interpretation of how the tactics worked. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.